Am I live on the right channel? If I am, it will show up a little bit late for me. I'm really hoping I am. I am. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Let me explain my tardiness. So, this week, my computer died. Bye-bye. All gone. So I'm using my laptop to do this live stream, as per usual. And I had a little bit of trouble, got a little mixy-matched. Whoopsie-daisy. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. ADD, Matthew, thank you so much for showing up, hitting like, everyone coming on in. Come on in. We're going to talk about the American Revolution today. Again, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit darker than usual because, again, my computer died. Real unfortunate. I lost a few things. These interviews I started doing last Thursday, oh man, I lost a few of them. It's really embarrassing, and I had to reach out to some people to do them again. So, enough about me. Let's get to the American Revolution. Again, hit like and subscribe if you're new here, of course. And this week we have a few really super interesting founders and a few really obscure founders. So we're going to start with last Thursday, where I wrote about Henry Fite. Actually, before I get going, I do want to say we talked about a John Henry last week, and I was asked how he died. And I looked into it, and I don't know. There are no, what I actually literally read was contemporary sources disagree. So, sorry to disappoint you, but I did want to make sure I got to that because, you guys ask me questions I can't answer, I write them down and try and get back to you next week with them. So, anyway, America's second capital. Let's talk about Henry Fite and his house. So, Henry Fite immigrated to the United States, or colonial America, with three of his brothers arriving in Philadelphia about 2 decades before the American Revolution. And while he was there, he started his life, and then the brothers separated and went to different places. And Henry Fite ended up in Baltimore, where he started a family and became fairly wealthy. And it seems that he made most of his money with renting, purchasing property. Found it. Nailed it. We're getting warmed up slow today. It's a very strange day for me. Henry Fite purchased property, made some money renting those out, and eventually he bought a giant building that he turned into not just an inn, but a hotel and a tavern, and had some stables, which become important. So, he builds this place in 1772. And 1776, at the end of 1776, the British are coming. At least that's what the Patriots think. So the first time that the Continental Congress evacuates Philadelphia, they actually go to Baltimore. Now, the British didn't end up coming this time, and they only went for 2 months. But they went to Baltimore, and where did they stay? The Henry Fite House. And the Henry Fite House, therefore, becomes essentially the second capital of the United States. After Philadelphia, of course. Now, again, they were only there for 2 months. It was a very brief time, but they used this Henry Fite House as the Capitol building. And one of the reasons that I saw several founders comment that was very appealing, specifically John Adams turned me onto this, and I looked more into it, is they had these great stables that could hold 30 horses. And I know that sounds kind of mundane and pointless, but at a time where you drove your horse to work and not your car, having stables that could hold 30 horses, I mean, that didn't even hold all of the horses the Continental Congressmen were bringing from around the 13 young states. So this was very important. And plus, it had all this room. Of course, it didn't have enough rooms for everyone, but it had a lot of rooms, which helped. And with the tavern, they had a meeting hall. And they spent a good portion of that winter in the Henry Fite House. Now, I do want to note, most of the information I got on this comes from actually a family history written by Fite's great-grandniece, I think is the relation, because she actually writes in her book about the 3 Fite brothers that came to colonial America and their descendants and all that. But she points out several things. First of all, the son Jacob Fite traditionally was given credit for building the house and owning it, but he never actually owned it. It was willed to him at one point, but it sounds like he passed away before the father did. So he never actually had ownership of it, though he definitely lived there for a good portion of his childhood. Furthermore, it is interesting to note that she wrote that in 1902 or 3, I think 1903. And the house, unfortunately, because it was a hotel, was destroyed in the Great Baltimore Fire, one of the biggest fires in United States history, in 1904, just a year after she wrote the book. So it's pretty much Henry Feight's story. Baltimore, for the 1800s, before it burnt down, used to refer to it as Old Congress Hall, because, well, most of the rest of the world doesn't recognize it as a place where the Continental Congress met. Well, Baltimore sure seems to hold on to that for a good amount of time. I should note that the house itself was actually lived in by George Peabody, who in the 1800s, if you're not familiar, became extraordinarily wealthy. One of the wealthiest Americans of the 1800s, if not ever, when you adjust for inflation. He started his enterprise there. He, of course, would go on to live in New York for a while and then London. And I'm not going to say much more because I don't know a lot about George Peabody. He lived a little bit after the time period I researched, but yeah. Yes, Mr. Dad, it is definitely, it was lost, as was a good portion of Baltimore itself. I did go off on a little bit of tangent reading about major disasters in American history, which was, probably more fun than it should have been, but can't read about the American Revolution all the time. Have to nerd out on some other things, and reading about the Revolution often trails me off to other things. So, Friday, as I've discussed, I was publishing about the Anti-Federalist Papers, and this week I published the essay of Montezuma. Now, Montezuma is a very interesting Anti-Federalist paper for several reasons. He only wrote one. I guess there were probably about 30 people who only wrote one, but of the famous ones, he's one of the few who only wrote one. And it's also noteworthy because it's one of the only ones that's really sarcastic. Like, there's a link to the article down in the blah blah blah. When we're done here, I suggest you go to my link because I then have a link to the paper, or just find Montezuma's essay for the Anti-Federalist paper. It's really brief, but it's hilarious. And because he's basically saying, yeah, great, we have a constitution, and now the Senate can just take over and rule as an aristocracy. Yeah, and we gave them a House of Representatives so that the people can send representatives that the Senate can now watch over and make sure they're not doing anything too democratic. Yeah. Like, he doesn't say yeah like I do. I'm paraphrasing, but, the essence is there. It's legitimately funny, and for me it's very refreshing because I read through so many primary sources, and once in a while something funny comes up, but for the most part, they're fighting a revolution. They're taking things pretty seriously most of the time. But to have this guy come out and just straight up be funny, it's like I said, it's a nice reprieve from the more serious things. The day before I was writing something I read first in a John Adams letter of 1770s. Not funny. John Adams, notably, not a funny guy. Anyway, although we do have another funny story coming up today, but we'll get to that. Again, the paper itself, as an Anti-Federalist paper, yeah, but yeah, we do this, yeah. So, I do want to note that while the name Montezuma, of course, is a pen name, and this is yet another Anti-Federalist who has been lost to history, we do not know the true identity of this author, and from my research, it doesn't seem like any historian has any idea at all, which is a little strange. But we also, because of that, don't know where the pen name Montezuma comes from. My estimation would be that it is from Montezuma II, and I also want to note that it is spelled differently than any other Montezuma I've seen up to that point. Montezuma now is a common place name around mostly Mexico, but in the United States as well. In fact, up here in upstate New York, we have Montezuma Park, which is a wildlife preserve. And that is spelled the way he spells it. But presumably it comes from Mexico and is after Montezuma II, and they spelled it differently down there. Although if you not that I use Wikipedia a ton, but if you go to Wikipedia, again, I don't know a ton about Montezuma, so while I was trying to figure out, I wonder who this is named after, I went to Wikipedia, And there's like 30 spellings of Montezuma on there, so none of which are this. None of them. So, from what I've cobbled together, it seems like he named it after Montezuma II, who was the ruler of the Aztec Empire in Mexico, or not Mexico yet, when Hernan Cortez shows up and conquers the Aztec Empire. And I estimate that he chose, or she chose this name because the author probably felt like this new, bigger government was coming to take over these less powerful governments. Just like the Spanish government came and took over the less powerful Aztec Empire, which power is not speculative, but what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's a general term. Like, Spain wasn't necessarily actually more powerful than the Aztecs because they ruled such a massive empire, but, you know, we all know how that ended. Sorry. So, I have interpreted that that is where the name came from. I did not read that anywhere else. I have no other reason to believe that other than the fact I looked up every Montezuma I can find, and that is the greatest parallel I could find. Interesting to note, too, that the Aztec Empire was conquered by Cortez by Montezuma 250 years before the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is about 250 years before today. So we're as close to the American founding as the American founders were to Spain conquering the Aztec Empire. And that was even before people really started settling North America. I mean, Mexico's North America, but British North America. I just put that together while I was doing... We've got off on a tangent here that's not so much about the American Revolution. I apologize about that. But I just found it really interesting that he was referencing something 250 years before, and we're here talking about something 250 years before. Call me crazy. I thought that was great. I am going to double check and make sure no one's asking any questions. Thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate it. Let's continue, though, with Dabney Carr. Of course, on the weekends, I like to reuse some older articles that I've written a very long time ago. And today, right now we're talking about last Saturday, where I wrote about Dabney Carr. Dabney Carr, if you're not familiar, was Thomas Jefferson's BFF. Childhood friends, grew up together. Used to study together. They both went to their primary schools together. I want to call it boarding school, but you know, they would travel there and back. It wasn't the same, but got their youthful education together and would study together and actually rode 2 miles from Jefferson's house to a hill that they... Thank you for your permission, Dad. They rode 2 miles up a hill to study on this hillside. They just really loved this hillside. And they made a pact. And they said, whoever dies first, the other friend will bury the first person on this hill. And they will both be buried on this hill. Now, that hill would become Monticello. And the burial ground would be the Jefferson family graveyard. Years in the future. Well, not that many years in the future. Because the 2 men went to William and Mary together. And they studied law together. And then they ran for the House of Burgesses in the Colonial Assembly together. And won together. And they went to the Virginia colonial government together. Thomas Jefferson and Dabney Carr. And then, when things started getting a little hairy with Great Britain, in March of 1773, one of these men stood on the floor of House of Burgesses and recommended creating a committee of correspondence just as their northern sister colonies had done. And this committee of correspondence was the first steps towards Virginia rebelling against the crown. And the man who stood up to recommend and motion that they vote to create a committee of correspondence was not Thomas Jefferson. It was Dabney Carr. And when they created this committee of correspondence, they chose 5 people to sit on this committee. They chose Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Francis Lightfoot Lee, and Dabney Carr. Now, 3 of those people would sign the Declaration of Independence. The other one, Patrick Henry, he would essentially leave early because he wanted to go be governor. And Dabney Carr was dead. As sad as it is to say, less than 2 months after he stood on the floor of the House of Burgesses and recommended they start on their path toward independence, though that's not exactly how he said it, they weren't expecting independence at that point, he caught a bilious fever, and died. He didn't see the First Continental Congress, which he probably would have been chosen to go to. He didn't see the Second Continental Congress, which he definitely would have been at. I can't say definitely, that's speculative, but like, come on. He was a leader in the revolution movement before there was a movement. And he dies. And Thomas Jefferson keeps his promise to his lifelong best friend, who, by the way, I forgot to mention, married Thomas's sister Martha, and was brother-in-law with Thomas Jefferson at this point. He dies, and Jefferson keeps his promise and brings Dabney Carr to the hillside where he was now constructing the home he dreamed of, Monticello, and buried him. And Dabney Carr became the first person in the Jefferson family graveyard. And it wouldn't be for another 53 years when a now former president, Thomas Jefferson, would be placed beside him in the same ground. And I just wanted to read you guys a quote here, an excerpt from his gravestone, which says, to his virtue, good sense, learning, and friendship, this stone is dedicated by Thomas Jefferson, who of all men loved him most. And it's a great story. It's super sad. Sorry to bum you out, but it's an amazing story from the American Revolution and the pre-revolution. And in a way, you know, Jefferson went on and did this for the both of them. He and Carr were in it together from childhood. And they were in their, I shouldn't say young 20s anymore, approaching 30 at this point. Jefferson was 32 when he wrote the Declaration, which is 3 years later, so 29. They were in their late 20s. Sorry to bum you out, but it's a really good story, and that's what you come to me for, right? So let's move on, and well, we'll check, see if there's any questions. It is super bittersweet, I know. Thomas Jefferson was the man, although he also did some gross things, I will acknowledge that. If you click in the article down below, I talk about it. Just before I wrote this great story, I remember very vividly a year and a half ago, I wrote about, you know, and maybe I'll publish it this weekend. I don't love putting it out there. I like to tell positive stories. I don't like to ignore the crappier parts of history, of course. It's just not so much fun for me. But his relationship with his other best friend's wife, Betsy Moore, was gross. Thomas Jefferson has a lot in common with Louis C.K., and I hope you can understand kind of what I mean by that. And yeah, like, you've seen the news. That's exactly what I mean. Maybe we'll talk about it next week. It was gross. So he wasn't the best guy in the whole world, but he was definitely interesting and definitely was sentimental. What I personally find, just a tangent for a second, what I find fascinating about Thomas Jefferson is how he embodies both the best and worst of what it means to be an American. He's the ultimate hypocrite. He has the highest, loftiest ideals, the grandest notions of what it means to be a human and what human rights are and how a person should relate to their government. But on the flip side, he's very selfish. He was kind of a jerk. He was unbecoming with his good friend's wife. And he obviously, you know, held humans as slaves, which I put lower on the list because that's a flaw he shared with so many of his contemporaries. It's terrible, and, like, I in no way condone it, but it's, as crazy as it is to say, owning slaves is far from the grossest thing Thomas Jefferson did. Again, I'm a giant Thomas Jefferson fan. Had I not spent the last few years trying to be super objective on this channel when it came to Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, let's just say I used to be much more swayed to the Jeffersonian perspective than the Hamiltonian one. So anyway, let's move on to something. Let's talk about Alexander Hamilton a little bit. We're going to talk about Charles Petit. And I'm going to take a quick sip of water because, as you know, I get real sweaty. Can't drink coffee at night anymore. I tried to drink coffee the last few times and, like, I'd be done. It'd be like 11 o'clock at night and I'm all jittery. I decided to just take a shower like an hour beforehand to wake me up. Is that okay? Is that too personal? Trying to be earnest with you guys. Trying to give, legitimate. Jefferson on the $2 bill, baby. Yes, he is. On those crisp $2 bills that no one uses. Okay, quick tangent. I have a friend who runs a bar in my old college town, Oneonta, New York. And what they do there is if you pay them money, they, instead of giving you a 5 back or 5 ones, because, college town bars will give you like a bunch of ones so you'll tip them. What they used to do is give 2 2s and a 1. Because you just throw down a 2. More people would just throw down a 2. They just don't want them. I just think the cleverest business move of all time for a primarily cash business. Although I was like, you guys got Jeffersons here. They're more rare than Franklins, I would suppose. Anyway, I saw some comments coming in real quick. Coffee in the evening. I like it. I can't anymore. I'm not as young as I used to be. Let's talk about Charles Petit. So, Charles Petit was a New Jerseyan. I don't know. He was from New Jersey, and he worked as the personal secretary to William Franklin, who you probably know as the son of Benjamin Franklin. And he was the royal governor of New Jersey, and Charles Petit was his personal assistant. Until Boston started getting treated like crap from the king. So, Charles Petit said, okay, I resign in protest. Woo, what a guy. So, William Franklin stays royal governor for a little bit, but that doesn't work out so well when independence is declared and William Livingston shows up to become governor of this new independent state, and William Franklin leaves, to say the least. So, what happens? Well, William Livingston hires Charles Petit back to his old job, and he becomes personal secretary to the new governor. Until the new Constitution is ratified. Well, William Livingston didn't actually become governor until the Constitution was ratified, but once that happened, after a few months, Charles Petit's title changed. Oh, Jason Burmis is actually the person who, runs the bar. Anyway, I'm going to go back. If you guys are interested in conspiracy theories, my friend has a much larger channel than I do that is all about conspiracies. Knock yourselves out. Retweets his own. I'm not promoting anything he says over there. I'm just saying it's, he's a lot of fun. I'm going to leave it at that. Anyway, so Charles Petit is working as personal secretary to Governor William Livingston. And then William Livingston and the New Jersey government changed things around, and Petit gets a new title, Secretary of State. And he is the first Secretary of State in the history of New Jersey. And he seems to do a pretty good job. But eventually he leaves because he's personally requested from the Continental Congress to come act as Deputy Quartermaster General for the Continental Army underneath Major General Nathaniel Greene, who did a great job. And he had a lot of good help from Charles Petit. Now, most notably from Charles Petit, what I found, there are two things, and at the end I am going to read you an hilarious letter. But Petit worked a lot in feeding the Continental Army, and in fact, at one point, he had a lot of trouble getting what they called forage. And forage could take on different terms depending on how you looked at it and who was speaking about what during the American Revolution, but he was very specifically talking about getting food, mostly wheats and greens, for the Continental Army to eat. And his problem was, while the South was doing a good job of getting food to feed the army in the South, the northern states weren't doing such a good job. Farmers in the North, unlike the South who had these giant plantations, often, I should note that there were many, many small farms in the South too. But in the North, these farmers were very independent of each other. And not only was it hard to get a stable price, they would sell their prices all over the place. Their foods at prices that were all over the place. And they would vary wildly, not just from farmer to farmer, but from purchase to purchase. They would just change their price. Because they could. Capitalism. Oh, your army needs food? Great. $100,000 for this cabbage, please. That's obviously an overestimation because they did want to sell the food, but that was the problem he was running into. So Petit wrote to George Washington outlining the situation the army found themselves in. And Washington made copies of Petit's letter and forwarded it with his own letter to all sorts of different, six different state governments. And he said, hey, look, this is the problem the quartermasters have. You guys need to help. And it actually worked. Most of those states, their legislations passed new rules for purchasing food for the Continental Army. Instead of having the Continental Army go do it, they would purchase it in bulk from people of the state, negotiating certain deals and things like that. And that was really the biggest role that Charles Petit played in the war itself. Now, Petit, having moved from New Jersey to Philadelphia to take on this role, especially because, I should mention, Nathaniel Greene said he would only take the position of quartermaster general if he could continue to fight in the field. But usually a quartermaster general would stay in Philadelphia and work with the Continental Congress, overseeing other people getting this food. So Charles Petit, as deputy quartermaster general, actually had a bigger role than you would usually expect. Again, Nathaniel Greene did a great job, but he had a great supporting cast, of which Charles Petit was one. But Petit moved from Jersey to Philadelphia to do this, and as with several people in the Continental Congress, moving to Pennsylvania, the people of Pennsylvania really liked him, and they ended up electing him, this former Secretary of State for New Jersey, to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. So, even though he was a New Jerseyan, he had been there long enough and they trusted him. And then eventually he went to the Continental Congress representing Pennsylvania. And the first person who pops in my mind is Gouverneur Morris of New York, who wrote the New York Constitution. I believe he signed the Articles of Confederation on behalf of New York. And then he signed the U.S. Constitution on behalf of Pennsylvania. And he's actually the one who wrote the preamble, we the people. That is Gouverneur Morris. So it's not uncommon for what Charles Petit did to have happened. I do want to say, after that he pretty much retired, but I have this really funny quote. As Quartermaster General, it wasn't just about getting food. He had to provide many, many things for the Continental Army. One of these things was saddles. And Alexander Hamilton really needed a saddle. And this is what I named the article after, but he wrote to Charles Petit in the third person, being funny, because he was trying to say, hey, remember I asked you for a saddle? Can you hurry up on that, please? So instead, he referred to himself in the third person as a joke, saying, Colonel Hamilton's compliments to Mr. Petit will be obliged to him if he can give him any hope of soon having the saddle he was so kind to undertake in procuring for him. At present, he is a sad, dismounted knight. And I just love the idea of Hamilton referring to himself as a sad, dismounted knight. Because of course he'd think of himself as a knight. He's so self-centered. But the idea that he's so sad about, all teary-eyed, and he phrases it as a joke, and I have to assume he is doing it as a joke because it's in the third person. If he was doing it in the first person, he would just simply be angry, and that is more of the Hamilton I'm accustomed to, but I just can't get the idea of just a mopey Alexander Hamilton walking around next to his horse, looking a lot like Lin-Manuel Miranda, because that's how I picture him now, and probably forever will. I saw some comments coming in. Let me see. Oh, a lot of things. That's not okay. Burma's high value. Yeah, Burma's is fine. Oh, thank you for the shout out. Yeah, everyone hitting like. Thank you all so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Any questions? That's cool. I saw him wondering, I was saw hay bales and wondered how they advertised their products in the old days. An endowment from Washington would certainly move items. Yeah. Generally speaking, when it came to advertising, anything was pretty much newspapers. And many newspapers even called themselves, man, I can't think of a specific name, but it would be like the Philadelphia Gazette and General Advertiser. Or, the New York blah 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 and General Advertiser. Because that's how they made their money, through subscriptions and advertising. I figured hay bales was what you were going for. Okay, let's see. Who's next? Abel James. How are we doing on time? We got through 4. Oh man, my screen's just a little bit different on the laptop. My tabs are a little bit off and it's driving me crazy. Okay, 30 minutes. Great, perfect. Then we are going to talk about Abel James. I'm going to take a quick sip while you think about Abel James. I didn't tell you what to think about. I'm not good at this. So Abel James is one of the few people named specifically who actually has part of a letter published in Ben Franklin's autobiography. Now, as someone, not only that, but part 2 of Ben Franklin's autobiography, he is the first part of part 2. The first sentence mentions Abel James. You'd think he'd be a little easier to find something about than most of the people I write about. These obscure Charles Petit. Who the heck is Charles Petit? No, you can find tons on Charles Petit. Abel James is almost impossible to find anything about. It's crazy. There were a few things about him and letters he wrote in the Founders Online at the National Archive, which is, of course, as I've said before, the most helpful thing in the whole world. I wouldn't be able to do Founder of the Day without it. Excuse me. What we do know about Abel James is he was older than many of the revolutionaries, younger than Benjamin Franklin, had known Benjamin Franklin absolutely forever. He was the president of James and Drinker, a merchant house in Philadelphia. He worked in he tried to open several factories, including Charles Thomson's failed attempt to open a linen factory. They were, in the 1760s, trying to help the poor who could make money over the summer with their farms, but in the wintertime really didn't have a lot of money coming in. And they wanted to be job creators because they were the wealthy. So they tried to create jobs by building a factory. Tell me if this sounds familiar. They tried to build a factory. Didn't seem to work. And it went under. He would invest in other factories. Silk Factory comes to mind, a few others throughout the years. An important member of Philadelphia society. When the Revolutionary War broke out, he had already been in the Colonial Assembly for several years. And in 1771, he spent a year on the Committee of Correspondence. We talked about it in Virginia before. There were Committee of Correspondences in almost every state. And Abel James worked for the Philadelphia Committee of Correspondence for 1 year. Until the following year, he was voted out of office entirely. And at this point, the Committee of Correspondences were originally a committee of the colonial government. And they only started taking over with the committees of safety that really took over once the royal governors started dissolving the colonial assemblies. That's when they transitioned to become the heads of the government. Till then, they were just offshoots. And it wasn't a big deal because, yeah, they were filing grievances with the king, but communication between the colonies didn't seem like that terrible an idea, especially as early as 1791. Although I will note that the Dabney Car wasn't until March of 1773 that they even started one. Anyway, mostly what Abel James did during his time in the Committee of Correspondence was communicate with Ben Franklin in London. Franklin was always in London. It was, until the Revolution. Then he went to France. Although the Revolution starts with him in London, to be fair. He fell out of favor with Abel James, that is, fell out of favor with the anti-Parliament crowd. As the sentiment against the king, or Parliament specifically, was growing, there's not a lot of information on whether James was a loyalist or a patriot. It seems to me that he was neither. there were a lot of people who just kind of stayed out of the revolution, especially wealthy people in Philadelphia. Especially wealthy people in Philadelphia, who just kind of played the let's see what happens here card. We don't care who's in charge. As long as we're the wealthy ones in Philadelphia, the money runs the show. So we'll just stay in charge and let them fight about, governing. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. So he seems to be one of these people who stay out. He was also very associated with Joseph Galloway, who famously was at the First Continental Congress and proposed the Galloway Plan of Union, which was an attempt to ease tensions with Great Britain, give the Americans a say in many matters, but not everything. Galloway, of course, would become a firm loyalist and leave the United States forever. So, Abel James was much like Franklin and many other people. He was back and forth from London several times throughout his life, and as the revolution got underway, he got voted out of office. He decided to go to London, and did go to London to work on his business. Now, where he becomes important is somehow, either from Franklin himself or from working with Franklin's taking care of his, not estate, he was still alive, but papers and stuff while Franklin was away. He somehow got his hands on an outline of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. So Ben Franklin started writing his autobiography while he was in London. Before the American Revolution even started, he wrote part one. But he had the outline for the whole thing, and somehow Abel James got his hand on it. And believe it or not, despite the fact that he wasn't part of the revolution, you've got to keep in mind, Ben Franklin was known throughout the Western world as a scientist. This is the man who invented the lightning rod, which most people looked at and said, he tamed God. Because until he invented the lightning rod, the tallest buildings in every city in the Western Hemisphere was a church. So when a building was struck by lightning, it was always the church. And if your churches were getting struck by lightning, you were clearly sinful, and it was clearly God's wrath being taken out on you. Now, this is the end of the Enlightenment, and that attitude was changing by and large. But even though that attitude was changing, that had been a traditional attitude, and Ben Franklin climbing up on roofs, not himself, but putting lightning rods around the world, he tamed God. And that made him probably more famous than the American Revolution. It's why when he first shows up in France, they already know his name. Because his image was already around. It was painted on cups and pictures and this and that. He was one of the first international celebrities of the modern age. So, Abel James, it says, hey man, this autobiography is a great idea. You're a humongous figure in history. And like Ben Franklin in his 80s is like, well, yeah. So, Abel James is one of the two people who really push him. James actually sends copies of the outline to other people around France, other Americans and French people around France, and says, hey guys, everyone, tell Ben to finish his autobiography. Including Thomas Jefferson gets a copy, and the only known copy that I was able to locate, not that I actually have it, but the only known copy of the outline is a translation made by William Short, who was Jefferson's assistant and a humongously important founder when it comes to Jeffersonian democracy and foreign policy. Because when Jefferson left France, his assistant, William Short, stayed behind for a long time through the French Revolution. And, we know Madison and James Monroe as disciples of Thomas Jefferson. William Short was one too, a very important one. But William Short made a copy of Jefferson's copy of Abel James's copy of Benjamin Franklin's original outline. And that's how we know about the outline. Now, James, unfortunately, he would return to the United States. No one seemed to care that he didn't take sides, as with many of the wealthy people in Philadelphia. But he speculated on a lot of land, as was common at the time. And as was common at the time for wealthy people in Philadelphia, he had significant losses and lost most of his fortune. And he was already very old when he passed away in 1790, just a year after Benjamin Franklin. That is Abel James. Hope I didn't lose too many of you. I don't know if he's boring or not. I don't know a ton about him. Or, I didn't know a ton about him. Super random person. Kind of on the border of founder, but he's in Ben Franklin's autobiography, which I have a copy here. I did put a link. Book of the week is Ben Franklin's autobiography. I did not put this one down. I put down a link for a bigger one, but there are hundreds of it. You can read it for free online. Doesn't matter. But you need to read it. It is one of the most important, it is probably the single most important autobiography in American history, and just a humongous read to learn about the thinking of Benjamin Franklin. And it's super easy to read, and when we're talking about humor, that guy's funny. most of the founders aren't funny. That dude's funny. I highly recommend it. I do think I saw a question or something come in. So you guys saying nice flag. This is my Bennington flag. I knocked off my arm of my chair because it's broken. This is the Bennington flag. It was probably never flown during the American Revolution or at Bennington. It is probably the first style of kind of memorabilia to mimic the feel of the Revolution that came out in the early 1800s, around the time of the War of 1812. They would have produced the Bennington flag to be like, remember how great the Rev War was? If you're interested, on my Patreon page, I've made a long video talking about the whole thing. So it's one of my earlier videos, probably not the best, but it's on there. So definitely support me on Patreon. TJ, I know you're on there. Go check it out. Matthew, it seems just about everyone lost money on land speculation. It doesn't mean someone was making all that money. I don't understand how it all worked. Random people is how their memories stay alive. Okay, let me take a drink of water, Matthew, and then I'll answer that. Because it's a long answer. I guess I can give you a short answer. The land speculation was essentially the stock market. So if you invest $1,000 in a stock and the company collapses, money's gone. It doesn't mean someone else is taking that money. It means the value of your product disappears. So, especially in upstate New York, this happened to several people. They bought a ton of land. Like, ton of land. Thinking, all right, now that after the French and Indian War, there was the line of proclamation. And they said, King said, colonists, stay on this side, don't go bother the Native Americans over there. After the American Revolution, we got all this land. And we said, we're going to go bother those Native Americans. We're going to move some settlers in. Let's go settle. I mean, they were already moving out to Kentucky and Tennessee. And the feeling was the same thing would happen in upstate New York. Spoiler alert, I live there now. So it kind of did. It was mostly would be people from New England. But the land didn't sell as wildly quick as everyone thought. There really weren't that many people looking for houses. And plus, coming out of a war, the economy isn't as good, so people just don't have that much money to spend. And the people who did move up here were primarily former soldiers who were given land by the Continental Army or their state to reward them in lieu of payment because no one had any money to pay them. So, during this decade, you have these speculators who not only buy their own land from the government, but they're trying to buy up, these soldiers who got this land instead of money, had a home in the city or home somewhere else. So they sold their land to wealthy people for money because they wanted money for their service. Now there's all this land to be sold and just not enough people to sell it to. And what they did is they had created companies and the companies bought the land. They just happened to own these companies. So they invested their money into a company. The company goes bankrupt and now they don't have any money. Because they paid their money into the company. They bought all this land. No one wants to buy the land. So what are they going to do? They can't sell it. It's not like they gave the money to anyone else. Well, they did. That's not true. They did buy the land. Now that I'm saying it out loud, they did buy the land. But they would have purchased that either from governments or people who already owned it. But again, they didn't lose that money for another decade when the housing market essentially collapsed. Not the housing market, the property market, but still. So in a nutshell, that's what happened. And so many wealthy people. In fact, you look at people like Robert Morris, who was the financier of the American Revolution. The man who paid for the American Revolution, mostly out of his own pocket. Also invested in land in upstate New York, I believe some in Maine too, and some down south. And he went bankrupt. And it was when he went bankrupt. I mean, this is the guy who at the Continental Congress said, I motioned George Washington be president of the Constitutional Convention, which was important because it was between George Washington and Robert Morris. It was that important where people didn't know which of those two people would be president of the Constitutional Convention. This is the man that turned down George Washington's offer to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. and said, no, I think you should take your friend Hamilton. And this is the guy that we created bankruptcy laws for, because when he went to debtor's prison, they were like, we can't leave Robert Morris in jail. He paid for the war. Like, we gotta get him out. And even off the top of my head, James Wilson, who was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, I think a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States, lost his money speculating and fled south while he was on the Supreme Court of the United States. The losses were real, but there wasn't anyone getting that money. Was that a sufficient tangent? I went very much off the track, but I love talking about this stuff. That's why we're here. You guys get to ask questions. We can go off on tangents. I think the shows are most fun when we do go off on tangents, because, I don't know, I speak from the heart instead of trying to, remember what I learned. Anyway, I will remember what I learned about Paul Hamilton. Right off the bat, Paul Hamilton, not related to Alexander Hamilton. Don't waste your time. Paul Hamilton dropped out of school as a teenager. He was a smart guy from a pretty wealthy family, but they ran into some financial trouble and he dropped out. In his teens, he joined the Continental Army and served throughout the South, most notably under the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion. After the Revolution ends, he joins politics, and he does pretty well in South Carolina. He lives, and he's doing pretty well in South Carolina politics. Serves in the Assembly for a while, and then the State Senate, and then becomes comptroller of the state, which again is a position that I still can't figure out exactly what they do. I know they oversee things and make sure, I'm pretty sure it's accountability, no one's breaking any laws, but either way, he does it for 5 years, and it's a pretty high level position. So, of all my studies of politics and history, just comptrollers, I finally can say it right, so let's leave it at that. So, he makes his way up, and not only is he comptroller, but eventually he's elected governor. He spends 2 years as governor of South Carolina. Now, there was something notable here regarding slavery that he was a part of. He wasn't necessarily the force behind it. It was the South Carolina government in general, but as the leader of the government, he does kind of take responsibility for it. And what happened was the federal government was considering, and this is in the early 1800s, during Thomas Jefferson's administration, the federal government was considering taxing the importation of slaves. Now, in the Constitution, slaves are only going to, it was a 20-year memorandum on slaves. They were closing in on the end of importation of slaves in general. So, from Hamilton's point of view, and the state of South Carolina's point of view, why would you tax slaves? We're trying to import the last few. And I know this sounds, pardon my language, but shitty of me to say. I get it. It's super racist. Slavery's terrible. I get it. But, taking it from their point of view, why would you charge taxes on the slaves? We can only import them for another year and a half. We're just trying to bring in as many as we can. And South Carolina already had a law on the books saying they would not import a male slave over the age of 15. Again, not a great look. But what they threatened was, if you start taxing slaves, we're going to start importing adult male slaves. And the state backed down. The federal government backed down. And then a year and a half later, they stopped importing any slaves. Either way. And again, their point was not hey, let's be super racist, terrible people about it. They were looking at it from a business standpoint. Again, their words, not mine. Please, don't cancel me. So, their attitude was, we're already changing our business operation. Because we're going to stop importing our labor very soon, we have to start changing our operation anyway. So throwing this tax on top of our already burdensome situation will make things nearly impossible for us. So we'll have to start import. If we're going to tax this, we're going to import grown men slaves because we would need that labor right away to make up for the money we're losing. Blah, blah, blah. And they backed down. Now, to put a little bit more of a positive light on Hamilton, who, again, was only a part of that conversation, but I did run into it while I was researching for this article, included in there because it's super interesting and we need to know these things. Hamilton would soon be chosen as James Madison, when Madison becomes president, as his Secretary of the Navy. And he goes to become Secretary of the Navy. And the most important thing he does in the 3 years, 12 minus 9 is 3, I can count. In the 3 years he's Secretary of the Navy, he focuses on 2 things. First of all, readiness and preparedness. So the Secretary of the Navy was a position only created under John Adams. It wasn't there right away. So Hamilton comes in as only the 3rd Secretary of the Navy ever. And the United States Navy was still small, although they were always building it. And one of the reasons Hamilton wanted, at least, if not Madison too, but Hamilton wanted to federalize was to build a stronger Navy to protect shipping interests and protect the coastlines. And Alexander Hamilton, but Paul Hamilton agreed with Alexander Hamilton on that kind of thing, and he helped boost the Navy. He really invested in it, tried to get Congress to invest in it, and made a very strong Navy, which would work out in the end because the War of 1812 would come around 3 years into his tenure. More importantly, perhaps, was his Naval Hospitals Act of 1811. And the act was passed by Congress, but he was the primary sponsor of it. And it was a very short act, but it essentially created a board which consisted of the Secretaries of the Navy, the Treasury, and War. Made up a board that oversaw the naval hospitals. And they were for, quote, they were supposed to care for, quote, sick and disabled seamen. So that's what they did. They started building hospitals for the Navy. Now, the Army had hospitals, but the Navy didn't specifically have that. This was a young Navy that was only, at this point, under Adams, 13 years old. They never got around to it, and he thought it was really important, which it was, and especially with the oncoming War of 1812. Now, Paul Hamilton didn't really see himself being taken. It's not that he wasn't taken seriously, but it seemed to him that James Madison wasn't giving him the attention he deserved. I don't mean to make it sound like a little crybaby, but he made a lot of recommendations that Madison just simply ignored. And so when the War of 1812 broke out, Paul Hamilton resigns his position, and it does seem, well, it was a little bit of, he won't listen to me. It was a little more of, he needs someone he's going to listen to if he wants to win the war. And in a way, was the most patriotic act of his life. So that is Paul Hamilton, 3rd Secretary of the U.S. Navy. I'm going to come over here and see if you guys are chat-shitting with me. Anything? Random people is how their memories stay alive. That's what we're doing here. Got it? Debtor's prison does sound... You like the tangents. Thank you, TJ. I like them too. Not necessarily my family. I like them too. I'm very hard to vacation with, if that makes any sense. Although I have the inclination that many of the people watching this are the same way. Oh, man. You see this? Look, that house is like 200 years old. Yeah, it's a house, Jay. It's a house. It's like 200 years old. Like, I'll walk around and be like, oh, man, that's a James Monroe house. Oh, that's a John Quincy Adams house, based on the year it was built. I live in a William Howard Taft house. One day, I hope to own at least a Jackson house. So, let's get to it. We are up to our last founder, Joseph Wood. Now, Joseph Wood is interesting from my perspective because I had been researching him for like, not very long, but long enough, probably 15 minutes, where I was like, this feels familiar. So I Googled Joseph Wood, and after Wikipedia, the second article that came up was Founder of the Day. What do you know? I wrote about him 2 years ago. Can't imagine. Because, you know, Joseph Wood is not famous at all, to the point where I forgot I wrote about him. Which is, like, it's weird. Like, this is not the first time it's happened, and it's oddly satisfying to me to be like, yeah, I covered him. Great. After 900 or so articles, I'm finally getting back to the beginning. But what's also interesting is this time when I was researching him, the story I picked out, because when I write the articles, I try and find, especially for the randos, I try and find a story that makes them stick out, makes them different than anyone else, because I could just obviously be like, went to the Continental Congress, fought in the war, for anyone. But I had found a totally different story from Joseph Wood this time than I had 2 years ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through both. I only have a link in the description for this week's story, but there is a link in that to get to the first one, right at the top. Joseph Wood was a Pennsylvaniaite who in the about 1774, he moved from Pennsylvania to Georgia. Now Georgia, and specifically St. John's Parish, was a hotspot. Georgia was primarily indifferent to the ramblings that were going on hundreds of miles north in Boston, except St. John's Parish, which was not just Pennsylvania relocators. There were a lot of people from Connecticut there too. A lot of Yankees lived in this particular area. So there was kind of a little hotspot for Patriots or Whigs compared to the rest of Georgia. And when I say parish, Georgia at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the same, but at the time, Georgia didn't really have counties, it had parishes. And mind you, Georgia was only about 40 years old at this point. It was only founded in the 1730s, and we're talking 1770s here. So it was super young. Most of the people in Georgia were first-generation Georgians because they were the first generation of people to live in Georgia. Except these relocators who came from the north in St. John's Parish. So Joseph Wood becomes a little bit of a rebel. He actually is one of two people sent by his parish who formed their own committee of correspondence without the Georgia government. He's one of two people who went to South Carolina to say, listen, St. John's Parish is with you. And this was done not just for their patriotism, but because the First Continental Congress was about to issue a boycott on everyone that imported British goods. So they needed to import something, and they thought better be friends with the North. South Carolina being the North in this situation. So they went to South Carolina. Okay, we're all good here. They went back. Georgia famously doesn't send anyone to the First Continental Congress at all. There were 12 colonies at the First Continental Congress. Second Continental Congress, St. John's Parish just says, hey, we got to do something. And they elected Lyman Hall to go to the Second Continental Congress on their behalf. And when he gets there, and this is a different story, but when he gets there, he presents his credentials, and the First Continental Congress debates, like, he was not sent by the Georgia Assembly. He was sent by a county. But then they also discussed how other places had done similar things, like New York for the First Continental Congress just 6 months earlier. The Colonial Assembly sent a bunch of people, but other people like Henry Wisner and William Floyd were sent by their county. And they were like, okay, and they actually sat Lyman Hall, and he would go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. Joseph Wood being one of the people who sent him there. So Wood would go north and fight in the war. And this is where this week's article comes in. This is the story I was researching this week when I realized I wrote about this dude. He went to the north and he joined the Pennsylvania line. He had lived in Pennsylvania just about 2 years earlier for most of his life until then. So they brought him into the Pennsylvania line, joins the Continental Army, goes and fights in the invasion of Canada, gets wounded, and comes down. And he joins as, I believe, a major. Yeah, a major. And then by a year and a half later, he's already a colonel, which is a huge jump. So there comes to be a little bit of a problem with officers of the Pennsylvania line. And notably, the rankings are kind of askew, and no one's really sure who's in charge. So Washington appoints a group of major and brigadier generals to come together and sort things out. And they do. And in their report, they essentially say some people were appointed by Florida. Some people were appointed by Florida. No one was appointed by Florida. Some people were appointed by Pennsylvania before the war in the militia. Some people were appointed by Pennsylvania when the war broke out. Some people were appointed by the Continental Congress. And many of them were also given promotions by either the militia, the state, or the Continental Army. This was not great for, an army that needed order and rank. And in this report, they specifically named Joseph Wood. And they say, what's the quote? I have a quote in here. They discuss his, he had jumped up in rank very quickly, as I said. And the boards that had this report filed says in it, Many deserving officers conceive themselves injured by Colonel Wood's extraordinary promotion. And extraordinary is their italics, not mine. Now, they also go on to say, we can't determine if he was... I'm going to paraphrase, but they basically say, we can't tell if he tricked people into thinking he was better than he was, or if he actually earned this promotion, but this is an example of a major problem, and we don't know what to do here. Now, as for Wood, word got back that this new organization was going. He used it as an opportunity to resign. Again, he was already wounded and had led men, so don't hate on him too much. And it just so happens that word arrived from Georgia, electing him to the Continental Congress. So, why go to war when you could sit in a boardroom? And that's what he did. And he spent 2 years in the Continental Congress, which seemed to suit him just fine. And interestingly, which I wrote back in the first article, he only spent about 6 months from the autumn of 1777 until the spring of 1778 in the Continental Congress. And while he was there, are those the right years? I think those are the right years. I'm going to double check. But while he was there, he was at York, Pennsylvania. He is one of the few, if not the only person, but one of the few people who served in the Continental Congress, and the only city he served in was York, Pennsylvania, while they had evacuated from the British. Excuse me, which, means it's the 1777. All right, sweet. Anyway, if I'm wrong, I will tell you next week. I'm going to look it up when we're done here. But I believe it was 77 to 78. So while he's there, and what I read, and again, I'd have to go through everyone's age at the time to verify this, but it does seem like he was at 65 years old, the oldest person at the Continental Congress while they were serving in York. Super fun fact to end with. Now I'm going to check and see if you guys have any questions. If you have any more, now's the time. You're going to go off on a tangent, throw something out at me. Now is the time. But it is getting late. We have hit an hour. You are also generous for coming and hitting like and subscribing. I'm assuming most of you got here because you're already subscribed. We've got fun stuff coming out this week. As I said, my computer died and I lost some of the interviews. I was going to be putting out an interview with Michael Troy of the Amrev podcast tomorrow. I don't think that's going to happen. Instead, I am going to probably publish an interview with Kyle Jenks, who is a James Madison interpreter from Philadelphia. And we talk a lot about not just James Madison, we go off a little bit on Patrick Henry for a while, which is fun. And he used the term Henry Mandering because he was rigging things in Virginia long before Elbridge Gerry was accused of it. And we also talk a little bit about being an interpreter and what that's like and how he gets into it and what you might want to do if that's something you're interested in. It was a fascinating conversation, and you should definitely come check it out tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching. I usually end with round bottom. I haven't decided if I'm sticking with it yet, because I have to explain it to people who are new. Go on founderoftheday.com and type in round bottom. It's not as gross as you would think. Thank you guys so much for watching. Always feel free to contact me, send me an email, tweet at me, Facebook, Instagram me. I'm trying to get better on Instagram. I'm just not very great at it. I don't have a lot of pictures to take because there's not a lot of founders at my house. But yeah, thank you again so much. And I'll be back live next week. Send me an email, ask me a question. I'm always at your disposal. I am your humble and obedient servant. Thank you for watching. Did it end? Okay.